one of my former seminary classmates, Greg Kokel, would say, never read a Bible verse. In other words, always read a verse in context, read backward and forward, and make sure that you know what's happening. So we're going to read the Matthew 15 version. And the reason I want to do this and read the whole thing is because, again, Amy and I are not only talking about how we answer this question of did Jesus use a racial slur, Amy and I are also trying to model for you how to do good Bible study. What kinds of questions should you ask when you hear a claim? What's the process? So kind of our first step in that process was, all right, what exactly is the claim? How can I summarize it? What are the major pieces of it? Really, the second step is go read the passage. There's no substitute for that. And I always tell my students when I'm teaching them how to interpret the Bible that to go read the whole passage in context, or as Amy's boss and one of my former seminary classmates, Greg Kokel, would say, never read a Bible verse. In other words, always read a verse in context, read backward and forward, and make sure that you know what's happening. So our story starts in Matthew 15, chapter 15, verse 21. So I'm going to read that for us, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to be reading out of the NIV. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from the vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment. Okay, so that's the chunk that this discussion belongs to. Amy, just as we're getting started here, let's just kind of start at verse 21 and work our way through it. Right at the beginning, like, why does Matthew give us a geography lesson? Like, why is he telling us that Jesus withdrew to Tyre and Sidon?
Okay, there are a lot of reasons for this, and there's a lot of background information that needs to come in here, because not only should we look at the passage, but we need to look at the whole Bible so we understand the history of how they got there, what's going on, what God's doing. All of these things play into this story, because the first thing you need to understand is the separation between the Jews and the Gentiles. So way back when God called Abraham, he eventually took them to Egypt. He had them isolated in Egypt because the Egyptians didn't want to be around them because they were shepherds and they thought that was unclean. And then eventually he moves them out. He gives them the law and he separates them from the cultures around them. And the reason why he does this, he doesn't do this for racial reasons. He does this for moral reasons. God's purpose from the beginning, from Genesis, he said to Abraham, "In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." So that is the promise made at the beginning of the story that God is now going to bring about by taking Abraham and creating a nation and giving them certain laws that would build up their society so that it would reflect God to the world, and it would create this culture where eventually Jesus would come and die for our sins.
So when you're talking about Abraham, you're going all the way back to Genesis 12, verses 1-3, where
Right.
God's kind of giving that promise to Abraham that he will be a blessing to the nations. So if we're going to understand what's happening in Matthew and Mark, we've kind of got to go
Right.
all the way back to what's called the Abrahamic covenant, God making that covenant of where the Jewish people are going to come from.
Because what we need to remember is that there was a separation between Jews and Gentiles, and there was a purpose for it, but it's all under the umbrella of ultimately bringing a blessing to the whole world. So that's how we kind of have to view this separation. So the separation through the law, because they weren't allowed to mix with the other cultures, because creating a culture is a huge deal, changing the way people think about the world. And I don't think we really appreciate this because we have been so saturated in biblical ideas for a long time in our culture, for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it takes time to create a mindset in a people. And when the other people groups have a completely different mindset that could cause issues, like they have the idol worship, they have sacrificing children, they have all sorts of things that God did not want the Israelites to do. So God is separating them out in order to build up this culture. But the important thing to remember is it was not a racial issue. It was a moral issue. In fact, when God has the Israelites drive out the Canaanites, he says, if you become like them, if you become like the people I'm judging, who, by the way, God waited 400 years until their sin was great enough to be punished. He says, I'm removing them from the land. But if you become like them, he says, as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you. So it was a promise that they're removed because of their sin, and you will be removed because of your sin. And in fact, that is what happens during the Babylonian exile. So they don't avoid the other people groups, and they do sin, and they do have problems. But ultimately, and I want to put this in perspective in one other way. Even in the law, even though they were separating from the nations around them, we need to understand what God said about these other people. Was he doing this because he hated them? Well, no. Here are a couple verses from the law. Deuteronomy 10:19, show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And he also says, if a stranger, and this is in Exodus 12, if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. So they were able to become part of this Mosaic covenant. If they were circumcised, they could become a part of it. They weren't excluded because of their ethnicity. The issue was cultural and moral, not ethnicity. So we see this all the way through, and that's the issue of the separation between the Jew and the Gentiles. Again, under the whole umbrella of God working out his grace, but in the meantime, they're separated from each other for the purpose of a culture and morality and eventually bringing about the Messiah.